Roger, it's so nice of you to come and have a chat about your memories of the Playhouse and the festival and the Arts Centre. I think if the word the great and the good was invented for anybody, it must be you in this context, because you have had such an involvement from the word go with each of those organisations. And I just would love to hear from you some memories and recollections of the forming of the three institutions.
Well, I wasn't around, of course, at the beginning of the Playhouse. I'm not quite that old. But I was certainly around at the beginning of what we call the new Playhouse. And it came about really by happenstance, really. I didn't sort of wake up one morning and say, God, the sun is shining, I must go out and annoy someone. What about starting an arts centre in a lovely old church? It came about because I found myself elected to the city council, as it was then, in 1968. And in my second term, I was made vice chairman of the publicity committee, which was a body set up to decide how to spend money to publicise Salisbury to the tourists. And they had, I think, a budget of about £4,000 to spend per year on leaflets and what have you. And about 24 people sat around a table pontificating how to do this. And after one of these meetings, under any other business, a guy called Anthony Hobson suddenly said, why don't we have a festival in Salisbury? And I've met two people, who are Elizabeth Jane Howard, the writer, and Geraint Jones, who will come and direct this thing. And they've persuaded the Arts Council to put up £3,000 if the City Council will match it. And people say, oh, no, we don't really want these sort of long-haired people wandering around. But I said, well, hold on, I think you're wrong. I think Salisbury is the fantastic place to hold a festival. And so we persuaded the publicity committee to recommend to the finance committee that they support the £3,000. And the finance committee threw it out. They said, well, we'd had a festival here, a one-off festival, about 10 years earlier, and it lost 1,500 quid. And we don't want that. It's a bottomless pit. We don't really want it. So it comes to the full council, and with a recommendation to reject the suggestion. And I got up and said, look, I think you're wrong. You know, I think, cut a long story short, I persuaded the city council to change the recommendation of the officers and go put up the money. And in the sort of time immemorial way that local bureaucrats do, they said, we've got to have someone on the festival board to represent the good burghers of Salisbury for this £3,000. Shove young Townsend on it, because it's his bloody idea. Get him on it, you see. So that's how I found myself going to the very first ever meeting of Salisbury Festival, knowing nothing whatsoever about the arts, having no particular ambitions in that way. And away it went, and Anthony Hobson set himself up with the chairman, and he got Lady Mary Dunn to be president, who was mother of Nell Dunn of Up the Junction fame, to be the president, and various people from round and about to do things, and me. And he set himself up as chairman. But then they decided the festival would be in June of the next year, 1973, bang smack in the middle of the Southern Cathedrals Festival, which they hadn't thought about at all, stupidly. But before that happened, I suddenly got a call one Saturday afternoon from both Jane Howard and Geraint saying, look, we're kind of fed up with Anthony, you know, meeting his pals, you know, and inviting him to come down and give a lecture in the festival, and there's 250 quid. And bear in mind, the budget's only £6,000, you know, for the whole thing. And we've decided that, you know, either he goes or we're going to go. So I said, well, fine, but what do you expect me to do about that? And they said, well, we want you to really sort out Anthony Hobson, and we'd like you to be the chairman. So I said, my goodness me, and here I was, sort of went to snapper, you know.
That was the hospital pass.
Well, exactly. And I thought, my goodness. And faced with the fact I'd really given my word to the council, we wouldn't go back and ask for any more money or anything like that. I thought, well, what can I do? So I did write to Anthony. He very gallantly fell on his sword. And so that's how I became the chairman. Pretty much had to set the thing up again from scratch. And that's how I became the chairman the first year. And we held all the first concerts in St Edmund's Church, as it was then. And one of those concerts was given by an Austrian Mozart specialist called Walter Klein. And after his recital in the church, we all went up round the piano and said, well done, old boy, well, fantastic recital, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, no, this is one of the finest concert halls in Europe. well, really? And so, well, fair enough. Little did he know how fantastic those words were, and how they'd come back to haunt us, really. And so we went on, and then the year after that, St Edmunds was made redundant. Salisbury was a guinea pig for the church commissioners to, they're all around the medieval cities in England. They'd had problems with the churches being in the wrong place. Yeah. They were all tightly in the old centres of the old cities. The populations had grown up and moved out into the suburbs, but the churches weren't there. And the churches that were left in the centre were dwindling congregations. So Salisbury was the guinea pig. And they opted to close St Edmunds, probably rightly, but huge campaigns fought by the different parishioners to keep their churches. And so St Edmunds was declared redundant. The next issue was, what were the church commissioners going to do with it? And really, they didn't have to spend any more money on. So they called a meeting, and again, I would say, of all the great and the good. And so the place was absolutely packed. I shouldn't think they'd had a bigger congregation for years, probably. Absolutely packed with every organisation you could think of, Unmarried Mothers, Meals on Wheels, the local clubs, St John's Ambit, anybody you could think of. And we went along, really, representing the festival, because we'd held these original concerts there. And I'm not too sure whether we heard what the plans of the church commissioners were at that stage. But it transpired during that meeting that the chairman of the Diocesan Board of Finance, a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Bullivant, said, look, we've really got, I suppose, 3 ideas for what we can do with this building. One is to try and persuade the Wiltshire County Council to make it into the county archives, board up all the windows, make it into a warehouse for the county archives. And the other one is to take off the roof, take out the windows, and make it like sort of Fountains Abbey, And the third one is demolish the place completely, raze it to the ground. Anyway, I got up and said, well, look, and this is crazy, you can't do this. This church was built 700 years ago for people to praise their God in, however they felt able to do so. All through the years, it survived the Civil War in the 17th century. It's one of the few towers Oliver Cromwell actually rebuilt in 1653 when it fell down, because St Edmunds was for the Commonwealth then, whereas St Thomas's was a royalist church. And so it's got, quite a lot of history to it. Yeah. And I said, here we've had these concerts here in last year, and Walter Klein from Austria described it as one of the finest concert halls in Europe. And here you are talking about taking the bloody roof off, And he said, well, who are you? I said, well, I'm representing Salisbury Festival. And he said, well, what do you want to do with the place? And I said, well, we'd really like it to make it into another Snape, another concert hall, a 500-seater concert hall maybe. And he said, well, have you got any organisation? And we said, no. And he's got any money? I said, well, no. Well, and nobody else had any ideas at all from the floor. And so he said, well, you better come and see us afterwards and see what we can do, which we duly did. And then somebody called Jane Whittle, who was at that meeting, but didn't speak too much at the meeting, came up to me and said, look, I'd love to make this place into a community art centre. And I said, well, what's that? Because in 1970, no one had really heard of community art centres. And she said, it's where people can come and do their thing. And I said, well, okay, why don't we combine forces and see what we can do? So we went along to the meeting with the Diocesan Board of Finance. And they said, well, look, we like your ideas, but we really don't think you're capable of looking after a medieval building. What we suggest is that if you can go along to the district council, as it then was, we will give them the building and the churchyard for nothing, free. And then you can enter into a deal with them to do what you mad things you want to do inside the building. Well, that's pretty positive. No, thank you very much. So off he went to the district council, chief executive, whoever it was. And we said, look, we've got this wonderful idea, we've got this fantastic deal where you could have this building and churchyard for absolutely for nothing. And they said, you must be mad, we don't want a medieval building, what you must be crazy, on your bike. the officers then recommended that the idea be turned down and that the offer from the Darson Board of Finance would be rejected. So we mounted a kind of what I would describe as a renter mob with placards to go along to the council meeting in the Guildhall where they were going to decide the fate of the building, and try and persuade them in the kindest possible way that to change their minds. and this is what we did. And we went along with our placards. It must have been 50, 60, 70 of us, I guess, something of that order. And we went up and into the gallery above the chamber. It must have frightened the councillors to death because they changed their mind. They reversed the decision of the officers, and they said, yes, we will take it on. But then the officers said, well, hold on one second. We'll only take it on if you, as your new organisation, put the church right, that we won't have to spend any capital on it for 25 years. Oh, well, okay, well, what's that going to cost? So we got a friendly architect who knew, Richard Hare, who knew about these sort of old buildings, to come along, and we reckoned it was going to cost £150,000 to put on, which, interesting enough, is the sort of money that the Playhouse was talking about when they first started talking about building a new Playhouse back in the early 60s, maybe. And got a lot of money then, But anyway, I thought, oh my gosh. But anyway, we set to with a fundraising committee. And blow me down, we raised £100,000 quite quickly. Well, relatively quickly. And we said to them, look, we put 100,000, we're on our way, and we then started to investigate the real state of the building. And of course, surprise, surprise, it wasn't £150,000, it was £250,000. So, and I thought, well, the council thought this is going to kill them stone dead, but people are not put off by reality, are they, very much? Enthusiasm, a simple thing like reality doesn't sort of daunt them too much. So when we went out, we did raise the other £250,000. The council kept their side of the bargain, and so I set up a new charitable organisation which pretty much mirrored the festival one. And they said, well, you're the only guy here with a suit. We better make you the chairman. and so that's how I became chairman the very first time. I was chairman for the first 10 years. And it was tough going, The place was a complete tip. It had no heating, no light, very primitive light, no loos at all. It was completely empty, and we had no real organisation to run it until we persuaded the Gulbenkian Foundation to put up £3,000 a year for 3 years, and that's how we got our first director, Claire Higney. That was her salary. And then the first 2 years was working in a building site. Well, can you imagine? It was absolutely hopeless. Then it just survived, and there it's gone on. And then along the way, Arthur Maidman, I think it was, who was the vice chairman of the theatre board here, said to me, look, what the next thing was that Guy Jessup, the chairman of the board of the theatre at the time, called a meeting because the Colchester Mercury had just been built at that time, and they got all the bugs out, and the architect was a guy called Norman Downey, I remember, and so the theatre board decided, if they could copy the blueprint of the Mercury, they got the bugs out, and what a sensible idea! Absolutely made a lot of sense. So he called a meeting in the old Playhouse. Again, anybody he could think of that might be interested, and I went along to it. And they said, well, the cost has now risen to £500,000. And this is in the 70s, bear in mind. I mean, the 1970s were absolutely turbulent years politically.
Inflation was huge.
I mean, it was 17% or something of that order. And there was the Yom Kippur War, and the oil prices absolutely quadrupled almost.
A 3-day week, I recall.
A 3-day week, share a bath, and all that sort of stuff. Exactly. There were tough times. There were tough times. And the people pretty much in the Playhouse said, this is not the right time to raise money. And I thought, well, again, I don't know about this. I mean, and I got up and said, look, from my certain knowledge as an outsider, I know you've been talking about building a theatre in Salisbury for as long as I can ever remember, really, and you've been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. There's really never a good time to raise money. There's always a reason why you shouldn't raise money in any year when you think about it. There's never a good reason. But here we are in times of quite rampant inflation. You know, it's going to be a tough call, but if you don't grasp the nettle now, you may never have a theatre because you'll be priced out of your range completely. And so they pretty much carried the day. The board said, right, we'll go for it. And then Arthur Maidman came to me after and said, look, would you be willing to join the board of the Playhouse? I said, well, that's very kind, how flattering. And if you like. And anyway, he came back 3 months later or whatever. I said, I'm terribly sorry, I don't quite know how to say this, but they've rejected you. And so I said, well, don't be upset, you know. Don't be upset, Arthur, about it. You know, nose get off my nose, and I wasn't ambitious to do it in the first place. And, you know, I just recall my life. As a matter of interest, why did they reject me? And they said, oh, they thought you'd be too radical for them. You see?
Right.
I don't know, really. That's an interesting one. But because bearing in mind the board at the time, of course, they'd been on there for years. I mean, it was a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Some of the directors have been on. I know one lovely guy called Francis Pullen, been on the board since there was a Garrison Theatre. You know, the best part of 40 years. And a lot of them have been on many, many years. And so sort of, what was I, 30s, like early 30s, a young whippersnapper like me, I guess would jar. Well, they thought it would anyway. But then, and then a little while went by, and Joe Benson came up to me and said, look, this is all rather silly. No, can we put your name forward? Can I put your name forward again? And I said, well, if you want to, Joe, I don't want to embarrass anybody over this, really. It's not that important to me. But, you know, then they came back and said, yes, we would invite me onto the board. And so that's how I became, you know, involved in the festival. I was the chairman of the festival, and I was chairman of the Arts Centre, and then on the Playhouse board. And that was the time that it was just being built. I mean, it was just about to be built, and I remember coming to the opening of it.
I've had no rehearsal.
And it was interesting, really, because the Playhouse board at the time was pretty long in the tooth, really, and there was an age limit on the directors of 70. And I remember vividly the very first item on the AGM every year was to waive the age limit. Otherwise, there were no directors left. You see, so this was the thing, was that, you know, carry nem common, you know, to carry this. That was fine. And then anybody else they wanted to invite, they just invited themselves, and nobody else had any input into it, and so they went on very merrily. And so that was how I really became involved in all the three organisations from the very start. And I stayed on the Playhouse board for 14 years because, I mean, there was you go on forever. And I really was the one at the time to say, look, come on, this is not even then the modern way of doing things. You know, we need to, and the festival, and both the festival and the Arts Centre both had 9-year limits on how long directors could serve on their boards, you know, with an optional year for the chairman to try and sort out succession. But otherwise, everybody had to go after 2 successive terms. Yeah. And really, the Playhouse really ought to come into line with that, and the Arts Council was starting to make noise in that direction. And so we did change the constitution of the Arts Centre, and having done 14 years, I mean, I led by example and left.
It gives you the most fantastic perspective on what's happening now in particular. I thought perhaps we could return to that perhaps later on. But what I wanted to do also was to ask you, because I've heard some of these stories, but I wanted you to tell us perhaps a few anecdotes you could recall from your time with the, especially with the festival. So I think you had some really interesting.
I suppose for all of them, really. I mean, let me think. I remember one of the things when I very soon got onto the board, and it was at the old Playhouse still, and they put on Equus, Peter Schaffer's Equus. It was the first time that nudity had ever been seen on the stage in Salisbury.
You've actually had full frontal nudity, haven't you?
Yes, in Equus. A little worried. My chairman didn't even want me to do the play whilst the appeal was on because he visualised a flood of letters in the press. We had no letters in the press at all, except from one lady who hadn't seen the play.
And of course, it's a very powerful play, Equus. And the two things about it I remember vividly is one, the place was packed with people who never normally come to the theatre, you've never seen the theatre before, that's the first thing. And the second thing was the board meeting afterwards. And it was, Francis, I remember very vividly. Shocking to see this nudity. I don't know what the place is coming to. I mean, what would the dean say? I hope the dean never came to see it. I mean, it is absolutely, gosh, what would the dean say? And I remember another lovely thing in the theatre, a very, very happy time, as far as I was concerned, in the theatre. And it happened actually at festival time. And I had a friend called Patrick Garland, who was quite a successful West End theatre director at the time. And he introduced Alan Bennett to us sometime before, who'd come down for his expenses to put on a sort of fundraiser in the double cube room at Wilton House. And he said to me, I've written an adaptation of Under the Greenwood Tree, Thomas Hardy Under the Greenwood Tree. And I'd love to do it in Salisbury. And so I went to Reggie Sahlberg and they said, look, Patrick Garland has offered to do this. And in festival time. And Reggie was very much a one for not having star names in his company. He wanted to encourage local actors, I mean, laudably so, but he was very much against using star names. And I remember saying, he was very worried that here was this West End director would come down to a little cosy little place like Salisbury and act like a prima donna and really upset all his faithful company. And so he was against it. I mean, and I persuaded him. I said, "Come on," I said, "Patrick's not like that, really." And then to cut a long story short, I mean, it was the most fantastic, happy occasion. I mean, not only was it a huge success, I think, here, but Patrick got it picked up by a London management company. It went to the Vaudeville Theatre, and Patrick, and this is typical of him, insisted that every member of the Salisbury company went up there and put it on. Yeah, I mean, maybe in some cases the only opportunity they ever would have had to go into the West End, and that was, it was a lovely show. I remember it very well.
You also mentioned, I've seen reference to Stephen Tennant coming to the festival.
Stephen Tennant.
You might, yes, you can tell us something about that.
Well, yes. I mean, a lot of people, I suspect, listening to this, watching this, probably don't know who Stephen Tennant was. But he came from, quite a titled family, the Connor family. And he was, how can I put this, quite a flamboyant character.
Was he Siegfried Sassoon's
Siegfried Sassoon, that's
yes.
Right. He was Siegfried Sassoon's lover, that's right. And he lived at that time at Wiltshire Manor, just north of Salisbury. And he was a great friend of Cecil Beaton, who was our president. And Cecil Beaton said, look, Stephen Tennant is going downhill, he's becoming a recluse, and we can't get him out of the house, and blah, blah, blah. And wouldn't it be lovely, do you think we could possibly give him an exhibition somewhere of his paintings? I thought, well, why not? Well, it wasn't me, but the director said, why not? So we duly did, but the problem was, of course, Stephen Tennant's paintings primarily were of tattooed sailors from Marseille, in sort of very puce and magenta colours. And we decided the only place we had available at that time was the vestry of St Thomas's Church. And so duly, these paintings were hung in the vestry. And Cecil Beaton's secretary, spent hours trying to sort out, and of course he kept changing his mind and having arguments. And our administrator at the time was a guy called John Wright, who was ex-bank manager, wasn't quite the Captain Mannering type, but almost. And of course you could imagine him with Stephen Tennant, were not a bit like fish to fowl, fish and to fowl, really. And so there was a bit of an argument about the poster, Stephen Tennant's poster. And, you know, there was a real flurry, and Cecil Beaton got involved, and it all became rather heated. And I sorted it out and wrote a letter of kind of apology to Stephen Tennant. And he invited me out to tea, you know, sent his card, picked me up. So, you know, we sat on the lawn, and he had a lot of pet lizards, you know, wandering around everywhere. And but we put on this exhibition, and, you know, it worked all right. But I mean, a biographer, I can't remember whose name the biographer was, said after, I cannot understand how anybody ever came to mount an exhibition of tattooed sailors in a vestry of a church, and whether it's ever happened since, I suspect with some conviction that it probably never has happened since. It was certainly a one-off at the time. But then again, that's what festivals are all about, isn't it?
Well, absolutely.
Pushing the boundaries.
Yes, exactly.
You know.
And we really need to, I mean, I think I'd like to just sort of come back to the theme I spoke about a bit earlier, which is about the resilience of the place and the challenges that you faced when, in all three organisations, you faced massive tasks ahead of you in terms of the amount of money to raise, but then all the setbacks along the way as well, when you thought you got the right amount and it was another 100,000. Yeah. And yet, just you persevered. And in doing so, you were supported by the community, so by everyone in Salisbury. There is this business of civic pride, and I think that's very evident still in Salisbury, as we've seen it more recently with appeals for the Playhouse, and the support we've had for the newly merged organisation. But one of the things that really struck me, and it was quite humbling, was when the lockdown was announced. And obviously we started having to cancel all the shows. The most heartwarming thing, I think, was obviously lots of people had paid in advance for their tickets. Sure. And so naturally they were given the option of would they like their money back, or would they like a voucher against future shows, or would they like to make a donation. And a colossal number of people just said keep the money. Yeah. And I think that speaks volumes for the future, actually, because it shows people are so invested in this organisation and so much want to succeed. And I don't know if you sort of have the same view of it, but it speaks to what you were talking about, doesn't it, really?
Well, I mean, certainly. I think I was right that Salisbury is a lovely place for the arts. I mean, it's a lovely city. It's got a lot of history. It's got a lot of history too in relation to the arts. And for a city of its population, I mean, Salisbury is extraordinarily lucky having the three cultural institutions that it does have. And they haven't happened by chance. And, you know, no one's waved a fairy wand and they've suddenly happened. People had to fight for it. And we had to fight damned hard for it. And, you know, there are comparisons to be drawn with what your situation you find yourself in, because, you know, no one is in living memory has ever faced a situation like we're in now. But there is a love, you're quite right, I'm sure it's still there, for the Playhouse and their arts organisations. There is that passion, and I suppose we saw it during the merger, really, that people fought their corners, didn't they, for the organisations that they loved over the years. And, you know, that's very heartwarming. And it's going to take quite a lot of courage from people, I think, to make that plunge. But they've got to do it. I mean, the same way as we did it 40-odd years ago, and not be put off by the first, you know, hurdle. Even if the hurdles got high, you know, you just keep going. They've got to do it again. People have got to take the plunge again and say, yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to make this live. I'm going to make this place come alive again, like we used to have it. Because it will come alive again, you know, and however many months it takes, I hope it's not going to be years, but in months ahead, it will come alive again. And hopefully what we've just lived through and what you've lived through, Tim, will be a bad memory.
Yes.
You know, but it will be a memory and something we'll always remember. Whatever organisation we've been involved in and are involved in, everybody suffered from the same burden. But it's got to work. With the festival, I was actively involved for 31 years as a director of it, and I was a chairman of it 3 times. And of course, a number of people ask me, what's your favourite memory? What's your biggest memory of all that time. And it's frankly an impossible question to ask. And you'll be asked the same question, Tim, I'm quite certain, when your time is done here. And there must have been, I don't know, thousands of shows I've seen. And I suppose the things that stick in my memory as much as anything else was the first major concert we had in the cathedral in 1978, would it be? We had Iona Brown, whose family lived in the Chalk Valley. She was the director of the Academy of St Martin in the Fields. And the festival director at the time was a guy called Richard Gregson Williams. It was his first year as a director. And he was a great lover of candles, but doing everything by candlelit, you know. And so we had the cathedral, you know, lit only with candles, and Iona Brown came down, and I think it was a Vivaldi concert from my memory. And the place was packed. I mean, it was the biggest concert in terms of numbers. I think there were about 2,000 people there, sitting on the tombs, you know, wherever they could cram in. Yeah. And this is the days before health and safety, or as you can imagine. And we put the candles out on the tombs, but of course what we didn't realise, of course, is the candles stripped down to the stones. And it was a disaster trying to get the candle wax out of these medieval stone. So we never again could have the numbers there that we done. We had to be a lot more circumspect about how we put the candles in afterwards and what we stood them on. But that was one memory I remember. But all the conductors we've had over the years, some of the world's finest conductors, unbelievable. You know, Riccardo Muti, Bardo, Carlo Maria Giulini with his wonderful languid fingers, a young 28-year-old Ivan Fischer, Hungarian conductor, conducting, I think it was Mahler's First Symphony, entirely from memory, not a note of music. And the noise in the cathedral, I mean, because there are bats and all sorts of birds roosting in the cathedral, and the bats and the birds were flying around, I mean, a cacophony of sound, I mean, it was just unbelievable. And I've been a sort of huge fan of Mahler ever since, really. I remember another occasion too, when we did something in fact it was at City Hall, no, it was in the City Hall, and we booked a satirical guitarist called Jake Thackeray. Do you remember? Well, that shows your age. He'd become quite popular in the evening BBC television newspaper with Cliff Mitchellmore. And he was coming down to do a one-man show. Anyway, again, I think a day before, his agent rang up and said, look, he's not well, or something's happened, he can't come. I thought, oh, God Almighty, we've got to give all the ticket money back, you know, it's the director's worst nightmare. And he said, don't worry, we've got someone else we could send in your place. It's a girl. People don't really know too much. But, you know, we think she's the next big thing. We can send her down. And so, all right, take a punt on it, you see. And we hope that our customers won't be too dismayed. Anyway, so the girl comes down, and suddenly she's doing her sound checks and what have you, up on the stage, and in walks Jake Thackeray into the auditorium. He said, well, no, what are you doing here? He said, well, what do you mean? I've come to do a show, and what's this girl doing here? And we said, well, we were told you were ill or you couldn't make it. And he said, well, of course I can make it. Here I am, blah, blah, blah. And he was a pretty fractious sort of chap, Jake Thackeray. And a bit of a set to, you know, happened. And, you know, he said, I'm doing my show, I'm contracted, you know, I'm doing it, I don't want her, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we agreed, an amicable thing, that she would do the first half as a warm-up, and Jake would do the second half. So that was agreed upon. Anyway, so of course, this girl went on and did her thing, and the audience didn't want to let her go. And when I tell you, that girl's name was Victoria Wood.
Was it?
Victoria Wood, yeah. Wonderful. Wasn't that amazing? Yes. And she came back 2 or 3 times afterwards, you know, with the usual sort of respect. Yeah, absolutely unbelievable. One of the highlights in Helen Marriage's time was because she was a big thing for doing things outside on a very spectacular scale. And she'd got a French company, a street company, to come along, and we needed a mobile crane with a 90-foot jib on it, the biggest crane you're allowed on the roads in the UK. And she wanted to put it up in the market square. And of course this thing was, there is a very ancient footpath, goes right across, diagonally across the market square. And the council said, you can't put that there mobile crane across this footpath. You know, it's been there since 1400 and whatever, and you know, you can't do it without an act of parliament. And I said, oh, come on. So we eventually did get it. And this company, I mean, absolutely astonishing. I mean, they had some sort of aluminium structure suspended from this crane. And as it was lifted upwards, hanging down from it were a whole lot of percussionists playing xylophones and timpani and God knows what, going higher and higher and higher and higher, playing. And this thing swung round. And when it got to about 90 foot up, the arms of this thing opened up, and underneath were two girls on trapezes. It's the most spectacular thing I've ever seen, doing it with no safety nets or anything like this. And these guys putting in absolutely spectacular. I should never forget that. No, there were some wonderful things. I mean, but you see, that's 25,000 quid and not a penny of income.
Yes.
You know,
it's you.
And people don't understand that.
No,
you know, when they
very
expect
strong nerves, don't you, sir?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful thing to do and terribly exciting and unforgettable. And I remember another thing, that we had a South African choir from the Val Reefs gold mine. It was the biggest gold mine in South Africa, to come. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, they had a very bad explosion in the mine, and about 10 guys were killed, including two, I believe, from the male voice choir. But they insisted on coming, and they did come. And we had that in the cathedral, and again, a vivid memory. I remember there must have been about 100 of them, I suppose. And people were standing on their chairs. I remember, and talk about the dean, I don't think the dean, but certainly the presenter was standing on his chair, you know, trying to get a view of it. It was absolutely electric. Yeah. You know, those sort of experiences live with you, really.
Yes, and that's the thing, isn't it? They do live with you, and we get the audiences to come back, so they will have those memories to salt away for them.
Yeah, of course. And the same in the theatre too. You know, put something on that's a little bit outside, and we don't understand who this is or where it's coming from, or, you know, come and try it. You never know, you might get blown away by it.
Well, and I suppose the other thing, of course, is these places are the cradles of future stars and future careers, and if you don't have the raw material being moulded.
Certainly plenty have come through these doors.
Absolutely.
Well, you Lennon Rossiter and all
you could name a few, yes.
You know, wonderful names have come and Tim West and all these sort of people, you know, have all trodden the old boards, and and where would they be now without places like this?
Exactly. Yeah.
And long may it continue.
Yes, absolutely. And
we've got to make it work.
And we will survive.
Of course.
Because there is such a impetus to making sure we do, and just to honour the legacies of the people like you and everybody else who built these things up to begin with. You know, we must make sure they do.
Well, I'm sure you will.
Well, Roger, thank you. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the trouble to come and talk to us.
It's been my pleasure.